didn't want to spend my summer in Long Island with my Uncle Robbie. My parents called it a character-building opportunity, which was just their way of saying, "We don't trust you alone while we go on vacation." So they packed me off with some vague promise about Robbie being able to show me the ropes of life. Uncle Robbie was an undertaker, not the kind of guy you'd picture in a suit, somberly consoling grieving families. He was the opposite. Robbie's vibe was sleazy. He wore big gold chains and open collar shirts. He greeted me at the train station with these gold-rimmed sunglasses that were too big for his face. "This summer's gonna be one for the books, my man," he told me as we packed into his convertible. It started out kind of fun. Robbie made me feel like an adult. He let me drink beer at his house, but didn't lecture me about responsibility. He took me to a topless bar that first weekend. He knew the bouncer, who didn't even card me. "Don't tell your mom about this," he said with a wink as we found a booth near the stage. The place was kind of grimy, but Robbie said it was his favorite spot in town. He was good with people, women especially. Despite feeling uncomfortable at first, we had a pretty good time. One afternoon, his best friend stopped by while we were having lunch. His name was Tony. He was short and balding, and his face was scarred like he'd been in fights his whole life. He barely spoke, mostly letting Robbie dominate the conversation. When he did talk, he sounded like he was always in a bad mood. But Robbie swore he was the best friend a guy could have. "The kind of guy who would help you bury a body," Uncle Robbie said, winking at Tony. After a while, I started noticing how strange Robbie's life really was. He had a small mortuary attached to his house, a family business he'd inherited from my grandfather. Most days, he didn't seem to do much actual work there, preferring to spend his time taking me out to bars or clubs. But one rainy afternoon, he told me he had to show me something in the mortuary. "You ever see a dead body up close?" he asked as we walked through the narrow hallway connecting his house to the mortuary. I shook my head, unsure if I wanted to. "Time to grow up, kid." The dressing room, as Robbie called it, was cold and smelled like chemicals. It was also cluttered with tools and makeup kits, the kind you'd see in a theater dressing room, except creepier. And then there was the body. A woman lay on the metal table in the center of the room, completely naked except for a sheet draped loosely over her legs. She had long, dark hair and a pretty face. Her skin looked like clay. "Should you be showing me this?" I asked. Robbie moved closer to the table and gestured at the woman's body like he was presenting a magic trick. "People think being an undertaker is all about coffins and funeral marches, but it's about transformation, making people beautiful again. It's an art." I felt queasy, but I couldn't stop looking. "Doesn't this bother you?" I asked, hoping he'd say something to reassure me. Instead, he rolled his eyes. "You think doctors freak out every time they see blood?" He brushed a strand of hair away from her face. "You'll get used to it." I didn't even want to be in the room anymore, but I stayed anyway, not wanting to look scared. What really bothered me was the way Robbie looked at her. Trying to fall asleep that night, I kept seeing her face. I thought about the way Robbie talked about her and looked at her. I told myself it was just his weird sense of humor. Why shouldn't he have a sense of humor about his work, even if it was dark? But something about the way he touched her hair kept looping in my head over and over. Was I overreacting? Robbie had been nothing but generous to me so far. He'd taken me out, introduced me to people, shown me a side of life I'd never experienced before. He wasn't a bad guy, was he? That was the first crack in the perfect summer he'd planned for me. The first time I wondered if there was more to Uncle Robbie than what he wanted me to see. A few days later, I met Robbie's girlfriend. She was pretty, blonde, but way too young for him. Maybe 23 or 24. Said her name was Jade, though I thought that seemed fake. She wore a tank top and cut-off shorts, which seemed a little casual in the setting of a mortuary. "This is my nephew," he said, grabbing me by the shoulder. "He's staying with me for the summer. I'm showing him the ropes." Jade smirked, sizing me up. "Bet the girls at school are all over you," she said. I stammered, feeling my face go hot. "Not really." Robbie was laughing. "This summer is going to be unforgettable," he said. I thought he meant more clubs, more drinking, more wild nights like the ones he'd already shown me. But as it turned out, Robbie's idea of unforgettable was a lot darker than I could have imagined. A week later, Robbie threw a party at his house. That's what he called it anyways. Really, it was just Jade, a friend of hers, and Robbie. I was the only guy there besides him, and I couldn't figure out why he'd invited me at all. Jade poured me a drink before I could say no. "Don't worry," she said. "We won't bite." Robbie was laughing on the couch, already a few beers deep. "Lighten up, kid. You're too uptight. Let the ladies take care of you tonight." I tried to play along, sipping the drink and pretending I was having a good time. But then Jade's friend started sliding her hand up my arm and leaning in close. "How old are you, sweetie?" 16, I said, thinking that would make her back off. She and Jade exchanged a look, and then they laughed. "16's legal in some places," Jade said. "You're practically a man." I tried to pull away, but they wouldn't let me go. They kept laughing, kept pushing drinks into my hand until the room started spinning. I don't remember much after that, just flashes. While Robbie sat in the corner, watching and laughing like he'd won some kind of sick game. I woke up in Robbie's guest room with a pounding headache and a sick feeling in my stomach. My clothes were a mess and my skin felt clammy. I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror. When I finally worked up the courage to talk to Robbie about it, he laughed in my face. "Oh, come on, kid," he said. "Last night was a blast." It felt wrong, I told him. He slammed the beer bottle down on the counter. "I gave you a memory you'll never forget, and this is how you thank me? By whining like a baby?" Then he stood up, towering over me. "You gonna tell your parents? Go ahead. See how far that gets you. You think they'll believe you? Or maybe they'll say you're ungrateful for all I've done for you." I didn't know how to answer. Then Robbie said, "I thought you were cool. Guess I was wrong." From that point on, everything changed. Robbie wasn't fun or easygoing anymore. He was moody, unpredictable, and cruel. He started making me help out in the mortuary more often, dragging me into the dressing room to teach me the ropes of embalming. The smell of chemicals and decay was sickening, and the heat only made it worse. It was the hottest summer I could remember, and Robbie was always drenched in sweat, his shirt sticking to his back as he leaned over the bodies. "This is Pepto-Bismol," he said one day, holding up a bottle of pink liquid. "Well, not the kind you drink. This stuff emulsifies human tissue, makes it nice and smooth. You want to try?" I shook my head, but he shoved the bottle into my hand anyway. By the end of July, he had me doing most of the work myself. One night, he handed me a scalpel and told me to open up a body while he stood back, watching and drinking from a flask he'd hidden in one of the coffins. "You're a natural," he said, laughing as I tried not to gag. just like your old man." This was around the time the noises started. Late at night, I'd hear strange sounds coming from the mortuary, shuffling, and then a groaning sound like someone was in pain. One time, I even thought I heard Robbie talking to someone. It sounded like he was talking to a child or something. But when I went to check, the mortuary was empty, except for him and the bodies. "What's the matter?" he asked when I confronted him about it. "You scared of the dead?" "No," I lied. I thought I heard something." "Yeah?" Robbie said, leaning against one of the metal tables, the dark sweat stains under his arms spreading down to his sides. "Maybe it's the ghosts," taking another swig from his flask. "This place is full of them. You get used to it." I felt trapped, like the walls of the mortuary were closing in on me. All I could hear was the steady drip of water from a leaking pipe in the corner. Robbie was watching me, waiting for some kind of reaction. When I didn't give him one, he just shook his head and said something under his breath. "You'll thank me for this someday," he said. That night, the noises started again, louder this time. I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the faint groans coming from the mortuary. It sounded like someone moving around, footsteps, followed by a low, guttural moan. I told myself it was nothing, just the pipes, or maybe the building settling. I waited until the noises stopped before I crept out of bed and down the hall. The door to the mortuary was open, and the light inside was dim and flickering. I could hear Robbie's voice, like he was talking to someone, or something. I peeked through the crack in the door and saw him standing over one of the bodies on the table. It was a woman with long, dark hair that spilled over the edge of the table like a curtain. Her face was pale and serene, like she was just sleeping. But the way Robbie was looking at her was all wrong. He was leaning over her, whispering something I couldn't make out. His breathing was heavy, almost labored, and there was this desperate look in his eyes. A strong smell of alcohol was in the air. I shifted and must have made a sound, because he suddenly straightened up and turned toward the door. For a split second, our eyes met, and my heart stopped. But then he smiled, that same grin he always wore, and gestured for me to come in. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice too casual, like nothing was wrong. I didn't move. I couldn't. My feet felt like they were glued to the floor, and my heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "Don't make me drag you in here," he said. I stumbled back, mumbling something about being tired before bolting down the hall. I didn't stop running until I was back in my room. The door slammed shut behind me, my mind racing. I didn't know what I'd just seen, but I knew one thing for sure. Uncle Robbie wasn't just some eccentric mortician. There was something seriously wrong with him, and I wasn't sure I'd make it out of that house alive. Things started getting worse after that night. Robbie barely talked to me unless it was to tell me what to do. He was more impatient than before, and when he wasn't ignoring me, he was dragging me deeper into his world. It didn't feel like I had much of a choice. If I pushed back, he just found a way to make me feel small, like I didn't understand anything. It started with the little things. I'd find weird stuff in the house when he wasn't around. One day I opened a drawer in his room looking for tape and found a stack of photo albums. At first I thought they'd just be family pictures, but they weren't. They were all pictures of women. Some of them were smiling, but most of them weren't. Their faces looked empty, and their skin looked like clay. I knew they were dead. I shoved the albums back in the drawer and tried to forget about it. Then there were the tapes. He kept them in a box in the basement, behind some old embalming equipment. I only found them because he sent me down there to get something one day, and the box wasn't hidden very well. I put one in the VCR in the living room when Robbie went out for more beer. It was grainy footage of a woman tied to a chair. She was limp and gray, but there was no sound. The angle was shaky, like it had been filmed with a camcorder. I ejected the tape before it went any further, but I already knew what I'd seen. I wanted to believe there was some explanation. Maybe it was fake. Maybe Robbie had worked on some low-budget horror movies in the past, and this was just part of that. But I knew better. I was starting to realize he didn't just mean embalming. Robbie found out. I don't know how, but he did. Maybe he'd seen the drawer slightly open, or noticed the tape wasn't rewound exactly where he left it. Either way, he knew. And now I couldn't breathe in the same room as him. One evening, Robbie slapped a hand on my shoulder and announced, "One last hurrah before summer's over, kid. A real banger. Everyone's coming." I tried to decline, saying something about being tired, but his hand tightened, his grin widening. "No excuses. You'll have fun. I promise." A week later, the night of the party, I walked into the living room and froze. The lights were dim. The air smelled faintly of chemicals. And there they were. Robbie's girlfriend Jade, her friend, and Tony, all sitting around the room. At first glance, it almost looked normal. But then I noticed the others. The bodies. They were posed around the room like grotesque party guests. Some slumped on the couch, others propped up in chairs. One was sitting at the dining table, its head tilted awkwardly, as if it were deep in conversation with Jade. All of them were pale, gray, and unmistakably dead. Jade poured a drink into a dead woman's gaping mouth, laughing hysterically as it spilled down her chin. Tony was smoking a cigar, leaning back against a corpse that was missing half its face. Robbie stood in the center of it all, his arm draped over a body like they were old pals. "Don't just stand there," Robbie said, holding up a camcorder. "Come on in. This is a party you'll never forget." I wanted to run, but Robbie's eyes locked on mine, daring me to disobey. I shuffled inside, my mind racing. "Relax, kid," Jade said, patting the spot next to her on the couch, next to a woman whose hands were bound with duct tape. "You've been too uptight all summer. Let loose a little." They handed me a drink. I didn't want it, but Robbie's grin was still there, and I knew if I didn't play along, things would get worse. I sipped it, my hands shaking so hard the drink almost spilled. The camcorder followed me wherever I went. Robbie made sure to capture everything. Jade leaning into me, Tony shoving a cigarette into the mouth of one of the bodies. The way I flinched every time someone laughed too loudly. "Smile for the camera," he kept saying. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I tried to edge toward the door. Robbie blocked my path, lowering the camcorder. "Not yet," he said. "We're just getting started." The next morning, I woke up in my room, my head pounding and my mouth dry. For a moment, I thought it might have been a nightmare, but then I saw the stack of Polaroids on the nightstand. They were blurry and distorted, but the contents were clear enough. Me, surrounded by the dead, holding a drink, smiling at the camera. Robbie walked in without knocking, holding the camcorder in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. "Morning, champ," he said, his voice cheery. "We got some great footage last night." I didn't say anything. "You're welcome, by the way," he added, setting the coffee down on the desk. Now you've got something to remember me by. And hey, don't worry about telling your folks. I'm sure they'd be real proud of how much you've grown this summer. When my parents came to pick me up a few days later, I could barely look them in the eye. Robbie stood on the porch, waving and grinning as if he were just a normal, proud uncle. Jade and Tony were behind him, leaning casually against the door frame, their eyes glinting with amusement. "How was your summer?" my mom asked as we packed my bags into the trunk. "Great," I said, forcing a smile. Robbie was great. As we pulled out of the driveway, I glanced back. Robbie was still standing there, his arm around Jade, a Polaroid camera dangling from his hand. Tony raised a beer bottle in a mock toast. And then we turned the corner, and they were gone. But the weight of their presence, of that house and everything that happened there, stayed with me. It always will.